Hello, I'm Andrew Susskind, and I'm a psychotherapist and author based on the west side of Los Angeles since 1992, specializing in trauma and addictive compulsive behaviors. Welcome to my podcast, named after my recent book and workbook, It's Not About the Sex. Here we have direct and honest conversations related to compulsive sexual behavior and trauma, all from a sexual health perspective. Our intention is to offer fresh viewpoints and practical strategies toward establishing greater intimacy and a more deeply connected life. Let's begin. According to the current working definition from the World Health Organization, sexual health is a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being in relation to sexuality. It is not merely the absence of disease, dysfunction, or infirmity. Sexual health requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences, free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. For sexual health to be attained and maintained, the sexual rights of all persons must be respected, protected, and fulfilled.
Hi, Andrew. How does sexual health fit into recovery from sexual compulsivity?
Great question, Sue. You know, it's interesting because sexual health is not even a term that is used that often in the 12-step rooms. Occasionally, nowadays, you will hear about sexual health or sex positive choices or behaviors. But I know back in the 90s, I never heard anybody talk about the term sexual health. Basically, because all of us as human beings are also sexual beings, right? With a sexual self as part of that. And we all have different ways of expressing our sexuality. This is an essential part of recovery. It's something that is part of our aliveness, part of our life force. And it's not something that we can take lightly or in a cavalier way. You know, I think sex is often talked about with euphemisms and with jargon that doesn't really help us understand ourselves. Sometimes it's kind of roundabout. And I know when I was growing up, I think you could agree with this. It was something that was taboo almost, and like almost like, ooh, if we get to talk about this, we're cool, or we get to break the rules by using the word sex or something, you know, something kind of secretive about
It
it.
was a secret or naughty or you're doing something wrong.
I think naughty is the word. I think
Yeah.
that somehow we were told we were naughty if we talked about it or explored it. Back to recovery and healing, you know, talking about anything without having to censor, without having to edit, can be a way to explore who we are as sexual beings. It's a way to investigate safer ways to be sexual and hopefully without it becoming chronically compulsive, right? Because that's what we're hopefully working away from. And just to continue a little bit, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Sue?
Well, I mean, what amazes me is that what you read at the top of this came out in 2006.
Yeah,
Right. So, I mean, I'm getting older, so time goes by a lot faster now, but that seems like that wasn't that long ago, right? In the
true.
whole scheme of like people having sex and the way it was being talked about. But when you were saying all that, I was thinking about sex positive. Like that's a kind of a theme now that you hear more and more and more.
Correct.
Um, and I liked how you explained that, how it's different, right? I mean, being sex positive is important, but being able to share and explore and be comfortable to talk about it and being safe is,
Yeah.
I think, really important.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. By the way, this particular definition has been revised through the years. So I believe I don't know this for sure, but I believe their first attempt as an organization, as a team of clinicians, began in the 90s. And so it's not a brand new thing. It's not just 2006, but I agree. I mean, we're evolving in a way that's allowing for a larger conversation, which I think is so vital, so important. Now, part of what I want to say is that when somebody's in a healing process, or they don't have to be in 12 step, but any kind of recovery process, whether it be from compulsive sexual behavior or trauma or both, oftentimes it's a trial and error kind of process, and not one to be taken lightly. Hopefully, it can be a process that is shared with someone that you trust, right? And that could be a therapist, it could be a coach, it could be a sponsor, or a trusted friend if you have somebody in your life who's really emotionally reliable. So trying to be open and honest about who you are, what your desires are, what you really like sexually. That's really what I'm talking about, rather than the secrecy and shame or the compartmentalizing that's often part of a compulsive pattern.
And I would think that it would be hard to pull yourself out of that. Like if you get kind of stuck in that pattern, just being able to speak up for yourself. And, I would think that that would take a lot of work to be able to do that.
Right. Right. And so going back to the very beginning of my first book, I believe that so much of sexual compulsivity is about brokenheartedness, right? So we're not talking just about sex here. And that's, I think, the balance, right? There's that healing process of working with the underlying pain, the brokenheartedness. But then does somebody reclaim their sexuality, or maybe claim their sexuality for the very first time?
Right. Yeah. And that can happen at any time in your life, right?
Exactly. It doesn't matter whether you're a teenager or whether you're a senior. Different people will address these issues at different phases of life.
When you're open to it. Right.
Exactly.
So, Andrew, I understand that you were inspired by your colleague, Doug Braun Harvey and Michael Vigorito, and you even included them in this chapter of your workbook. Can you read the portion of this to us?
I would love to. So it goes like this. Although I've been familiar with the World Health Organization definition for many years, its significance only came to my attention recently as part of a workshop I attended that was given by my talented colleagues, Douglas Braun Harvey and Michael Vigorito. They have developed a non-pathologizing, affirming, and forward-thinking sexual health model that destigmatizes compulsive sexual behavior and celebrates movement toward greater sexual expression. I believe this approach is a missing link toward creating more liberating, conscious sexual health as part of long-term recovery. In their book, Treating Out of Control Sexual Behaviors, Rethinking Sex Addiction, they define out of control sexual behavior as a sexual problem of consensual urges, thoughts, or behaviors that feel out of control for the individual. They go on to say that sexual health conversations matter. Their open-hearted approach was developed after many years of working with their clients who buried their sexual stories rather than through open and inquisitive exploration.
Can you say a little bit more about how this inspired you?
It inspired me on many levels, both professionally and personally, because Doug and Michael are two very talented clinicians, two wholehearted individuals, and really speak to the sexual health angle of healing from compulsive sexual behavior. They call it out of control sexual behavior. I believe that they're very similar, just different language, but I'll just use OCSB, out of control sexual behavior, to respect their research. The thing that inspires me the most is that it's all from a sexual health perspective. So they don't pathologize, they don't stigmatize, they don't look at this from an addiction model or a disease model. And their language is very thoughtful and very meticulous. when it comes to research and allowing for a space to explore one's sexuality in a safe enough way. And what they did, just to go back for a moment, is they used to run groups together in San Diego for, I want to say, 20 years or so. And the groups were specifically for gay men who identified with some kind of out of control sexual behavior. And so through their experience week in and week out working with these folks down there, they developed their model. They talked about how three main things were important to consider. One was attachment styles, the second was nervous system regulation, and the third was erotic conflicts. I just found this so concise and so significant to the field that when I read their book, actually during the pandemic, it just lit a fire underneath of me, and I've been riding that wave ever since.
You mentioned a little earlier, and again, I just kind of wanted to dive a little deeper into
Mhm.
the 12-step programs because it seems like that sexual health approach isn't really talked about in the rooms. Is that true?
Right. I don't know for sure about this, but I don't think sexual health was talked about much in general, not just in the 12-step rooms, but I think it has been something that has emerged because there's obviously a gap in some of the clinical work and some of the 12-step work out there. And since I've been part of the 12-step community myself since 94, I feel like I have a little bit of a bird's eye view on what was talked about and what wasn't. And I never heard people talking about the word pleasure. I never heard people talking about sexual health. So nowadays, the conversation seems to be shifting, which is exciting to me. And I'm not sure exactly what's making that possible, but there's a lot more opportunity for this notion of sexual health being equivalent to mental health and physical health and spiritual health, et cetera. I'm of the belief that there's lots of room for everything, that hopefully in the 12-step rooms, there can be more acceptance and expansion of what it means to talk about, issues that have been also compartmentalized, which is the last thing we want to do because that's oftentimes what fuels compulsive sexual behavior. So, I have some hope that we're moving in the right direction, and it's exciting to me.
So I kind of think like when you were talking about that and the evolution of even psychology, how it's getting to be more like positive psychology is a big thing. So this kind of seems like it's maybe behind that a little bit as it's following the evolution of speaking about the positive things in this and not just focusing on the negatives. I think it's becoming more known that there's better ways to deal with addiction. So I think we're evolving in a lot of these trends here.
I couldn't agree more. I think we are moving in the direction of creating sex positive conversations more openly and more readily. Both in 12 step and in therapy offices and in, the world at large, hopefully. And, I just want to remind you that we come from a puritanical background.
Exactly.
And even though it's been a few hundred years since the Puritans arrived, and you know all about that since you're from that part of the world, that it's unusual that it lingers, but I think it goes back and forth sometimes, and we're on a steep learning curve still.
Yeah. Hopefully we're still going up. But well, speaking of sexual health, I know you have a portion of this chapter called Reviving Pleasure. And can you read a little bit of that for us?
Of course. Pleasure is a word that is often overlooked in the 12-step rooms. Instead, there is a focus on what's wrong or what's missing. We're going to turn things around and look at what's right and what could be even better. It's been a few hundred years since puritanical beliefs thrived in early America, when sex for pleasure was seen as morally wrong. Yet, religious dogma continues to exist in our society today, and some faith communities still contribute to confusion and shame based on rigid, outdated rules, such as prohibition of same-sex practices, as well as sex before marriage. Fortunately, religious rigidity is not as pervasive today, but for many, our sexual attitudes and behaviors remain constricted, with an emphasis on positive and respectful, as well as pleasurable and safe sexual experiences. The universally accepted definition of sexual health demonstrates how far we have come on an international level, but we still have a long way to go.
So what I'm hearing is that sometimes we get pleasure deprived, and in recovery from sexual compulsivity, that the word pleasure, as you mentioned, really gets overlooked.
I love what you said about pleasure deprived because sometimes I feel that way. I feel like I'm learning in my own life how to make room for pleasure, how to cultivate pleasure. And the word pleasure, because it has different connotations for different people, becomes almost this thing that I know that I push away, that I'm not supposed to have too much pleasure. And you know, I heard this speaker a while ago who was a pleasure researcher. And I had never met a pleasure researcher. That was her main focus. And I thought to myself, wow, so I am a recovering workaholic and I'm a recovering list maker, a recovering perfectionist, a recovering busy holic. But in my life, now that I'm slowing down a little bit, I really want to get to know what pleasure truly means to me. And I think that's what is the opening dialogue is what is pleasure to you? What would you like pleasure to look like? What is your vision of pleasure in your life and in your recovery?
I'm going to start asking myself that. So I understand you really want to normalize fantasy, and you have even heard people in meetings identify as fantasy addicts. Can you read from your book about the fantasy and how it can be a healthier way to navigate life's ups and downs?
Sure. So one thing I want to say about fantasy is that it again gets a bad rap, especially in some of the 12-step rooms. So this section is called Considering Fantasy as a Survival Strategy. Fantasy is defined as imagination, especially when extravagant and unrestrained. And it can also be a liberating exploration of your wants and desires, both sexual and romantic. Is it possible that fantasy can be safe and productive? Can your imagination, even if extravagant or unrestrained, be integrated into your revised sexual health plan? The answer is yes and no. Fantasy can simply be a safe voyage into your wildest dreams, or it can be a survival strategy to transcend painful and overwhelming circumstances. For example, you know by now that I grew up in an emotionally unstable and sometimes turbulent home. As a kid, I was a TV holic, and many of my favorite shows, such as The Wonderful World of Disney, Happy Days, and The Love Boat, served as mini vacations from the reality of my family. I eagerly look forward to Saturday night at 9 to discover the guest celebrities on The Love Boat and Fantasy Island as they traveled to exotic destinations. This weekly escape was the perfect remedy for a young child stuck in a family overflowing with misery. At first, fantasy served a purpose in my childhood, but as an adult, it became out of control at times, leading to highly obsessive thoughts, compulsive behaviors, and negative consequences. In my case, it started very innocently. My best friend became my first romantic interest at age 5. At the time, I had no understanding of the depth of the fantasy, but he seemed to have a loving family who adopted me and became one of the many surrogate families in my childhood. As part of my survival, I always had a best friend who became the object of my affection, admiration, and fantasy at times. When I reached puberty, sexual fantasy kicked into full gear, and although innocent at first, it unraveled into more obsessive and compulsive behaviors into my young adult years. I didn't realize this at the time, but my young, impressionable brain was hyper-focused on painful, obsessive longings, both romantic and sexual. Fantasy had become agonizing.
Yeah. So fantasy, like you mentioned, can be a survival strategy, like a coping mechanism, or it can end up being an ally.
That's right.
But not to say that can't be troublesome or you can't become obsessed at times, but
Yeah.
needing to stay open to learn more about what it is a great suggestion. And I
Yeah.
feel like, some people will get lost in books. They're
Right.
living in that fantasy and they just devour books and books and books and books. And I see that as an obsession, right? As them
Hmm.
escaping the reality. So it's finding that balance, that's healthy.
I think that's the question is finding the balance. When it crosses the line into pain and suffering, that's when it's lost its balance, right?
Yeah.
When it is
Like
safe
isolation.
enough, yeah. I mean, if it's safe enough and it's productive enough, that's where it's actually useful.
Mhm.
I just wanted to go back for a quick second. In Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, there are folks who identify as fantasy addicts. And the reason that catches my attention all the time is it feels to me like it pathologizes fantasy. And I don't think it's helpful to pathologize or stigmatize fantasy as much as it's an opportunity to look at it and understand it and explore it in deeper ways to understand how it serves a purpose. And of course, if it causes suffering, then there's a question of, well, how to create boundaries, how to diffuse whatever that is down deep that's causing that painful cycle. But in terms of identifying as a fantasy addict, I have trouble with that expression. I just don't want people to make it good or bad, right or wrong. That to me is too moralistic, too black and white, and really takes away the freedom to explore what it truly means to an individual.
Like we said earlier, people becoming more aware and finding that balance. And once they get there, then they can understand a little more of how they can manage it.
Yeah, and the word that came to me when you said balance this time was freedom, right? Because I think out of control sexual behavior, as Doug and Michael talk about, is so constricting. And even though it looks like somebody's out of control, at the same time, their sexuality is often very narrow
Mhm.
and doesn't have a whole lot of expansion or expression or exploration attached to it.
All right. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. Now, at the end of the chapter, you share your, I'm saying that like that in quotes. Um,
Sure.
so, at the end of this chapter, we're going to share your practice with your listeners. And do you want to start us off?
Of course.
Okay.
Number one, sexual health is a core aspect of your overall well-being. Prioritize it as a step toward more vitality and pleasure.
Number two, if you have been viewing porn images for many years, know that your brain and your body need to recalibrate. It can take up to a year to physiologically shift from images on a screen to a real person in front of you. Exploring your sexual self is a brave new territory.
Three, if you experience erectile problems without the use of porn, speak to a trusted physician or sexual health professional who can walk you through some steps to get to know your body again.
Number four, sex therapists and sex coaches are trained to focus on sexual health issues. Sex addiction therapists are trained to focus on compulsive sexual behaviors. Ideally, find someone who is trained and certified in both areas. When sexual expression gets buried, it becomes more secretive and shameful, resulting in unnecessary suffering.
5. Consider 12-step support if you identify your issue as compulsive and persistent. You are biologically wired for connection, and 12-step communities may provide a sense of belonging based on sharing a similar problem.
Number 6, once your sexual compulsivity has slowed down, ask your therapist to help you develop a sexual health vision. Include pleasure, fantasy, and erotic desire as part of this honest conversation. You deserve a fun and liberating sex life.
And number 7, consider joining a therapy group with an emphasis on sexual health. Group therapy offers its members a powerful opportunity to build shame resiliency and camaraderie. Thank you for listening today. It was wonderful sharing this time with my colleague and my friend, Sue Merlino, and discussing this topic called revitalizing sexual health. If you're so inclined, please give us a 5-star rating and be sure to subscribe and share my podcast with those who may benefit. I look forward to you joining us the next time, and don't forget to stay connected.